So, we've seen really over the past couple of years that there is really been a push, mainly, mainly by the right wing, not only just in America or here in the UK, but around the world. We have seen the right wing try to essentially engineer what they call a free speech crisis. And indeed, many of these issues of free speech are entirely inventions by the right wing. For example, the best one we've seen most recently was Donald Trump getting kicked off Twitter. At the end of the day, Donald Trump hasn't lost his freedom of speech. Twitter is a privately owned platform, and they have a terms of service which you have to agree to when you start to use their platform. They have said that Donald Trump has repeatedly broken those, and well, they've now seen finally fit to essentially get rid of him. You know, good, about time. But this is what a lot of, especially people on the left, have been warning about for quite some time. We've seen the deletion of Parler, although that has now slipped to some sort of Russian-owned oligarch, which again spells a whole heap of trouble, if you ask me. But that's, I think, something else to discuss another time. But yeah, this is completely a manufactured crisis by the right wing, and there are legitimate issues for free speech in here and around the world, here and around, especially in like what we call the West. But they're really not overly major issues. I mean, if you lose your Twitter account, it's not really a free speech issue. You've just lost your Twitter account. You haven't been sent to the gulags for complaining against the government. If I did what I was doing in China, I would have probably disappeared long ago. But that's the difference between having a country with proper free speech, which is now having to deal, I suppose, with the advent of the internet. And how do you deal with the internet in that age? We still really haven't got to grips with it, and I would say that much of the problems really from the past couple of years have been because of that. But again, I think that's another discussion for another time. But today we are going to get into essentially this manufactured free speech crisis. And before we get into that, please do hit the like and share button. And of course, down below there are links to my Patreon page and a one-off donation link. And thank you very much to those people who do support me that way. So, this comes from politics.co.uk, and the title of the article is The Invented Free Speech Crisis. So, free speech campaigners are fond of describing things as Orwellian. For me, one of the most compelling passages of 1984 is the description of doublethink. The power of holding two contradictory beliefs in one's mind simultaneously and accepting both of them. The term doublethink is aptly applied to our current debate. Freedom of speech traditionally and largely means that broadly the state cannot punish or disadvantage individuals for expressing an opinion or belief. Increasingly, however, a small but highly influential group has attempted to claim the mantle of free speech to justify the opposite of expanding coercive state control over what we can say in public. These, quote, pseudo-free speech activists might normally be dismissed as cranks, yet they exercise substantial influence over our governments and laws. Their current focus appears to be primarily on universities. The 2019 Conservative Manifesto contained a promise to, quote, strengthen free speech in universities. Last week, the university's minister, Michelle Donnellan, threatened legislation, to protect free speech in universities. On the same day, Andrew Lear, the MP, organised a letter signed by 21 Conservative MPs calling on the Prime Minister to crack down on censorship in higher education. The letter was a report by the right-wing Adam Smith Institute claiming that free speech is under threat on campuses. 2 days later, David Davis introduced a 10-minute rule bill which would allow the government to fine universities that permit students to deny a platform to racist and homophobic speakers. Again, you can see where this is going. In their, quote, seminal study of how elected leaders can subvert democratic values, Harvard Stephen Lewinsky and Daniel Zabat describe how, quote, elected autocrats use invented crises to expand their own power. While it may be premature to apply Lewinsky's and Zabat's entire thesis to the UK, the crisis in free speech is definitely invented. When one drills down to any example of, quote, censorship described by the pseudo-free speech activists, it becomes clear that these are not attacks on free speech, but rather examples of traditional privileged individuals being treated just like everyone else. Just a few examples can illustrate this point. The ISI's intent that Peter Tanachel had to be, quote, no platformed, amounting to nothing more than an NUS representative declining to appear at the same event. In fact, according to our government's own figures for the Office for Students in 2017 to 2018, just 0.1% were actually blocked. And a study of over 10,000 student events in 2020 by the higher education think tank, I think that's Wonky, I think that's how you say it, found of just 2 instances of no platforming. One involved a convicted fraudster, and the other was Jeremy Corbyn. In 2017, The Telegraph claimed that students forced Cambridge to drop white authors. The student had done no more than to put a request for some non-white authors to be introduced in the entirely white curriculum. Matthew Goodwin, of one of the most highest profile proponents of this pseudo crisis, claims that his, quote, academic freedom is infringed because of his right-wing views. Just think about that. All a student did was say, can we have some more examples of non-white authors? That's not infringing on this guy's academic freedom. It was just a request by students. And yet, look how much they've cried about that for years. Yet, as an example, he offers very little more than the time a colleague described him as problematic. Professor Kathleen Stock's warning that the LGBTQ plus charity Stonewall had politically captured every academic institution in the UK turned out to be mainly a complaint that some institutions had adopted the charity's diversity's champion kite mark. Another version of the pseudo-crisis is the claim that, quote, cancel culture has made those with right-wing views feel afraid to speak out. But given the majority of the UK's media is at best funded by think tanks and its government all platformed right-wing views, this contention appears somewhat strange. Nevertheless, it is repeated in the recent report by Policy Exchange. Given, however, that pseudo-crisis narratives is repeated in most news outlets across social media, Policy Exchange results could just as easily be the result of perception as reality. At the root of the pseudo-crisis narratives are two contradictions. First, of speech with platform. Speech is a right, platform is a privilege. Universities and student unions are independent organisations and are entitled to offer their platform to whoever they so choose. Similarly, Stonewall is entitled to put whatever conditions it wants on the use of its kite mark. Davis is introducing his bill combined with various colleagues that had been, quote, no platformed. But Davis and his friends have no more right to speak at universities than I have to perform on Strictly Come Dancing. Both are limited platforms, i.e., not everyone can be included. And both belong to independent organisations. The second confliction is of censorship with criticism. Professor Stork, that's nice, I think that's how you say it, claimed in the Mail on Sunday, not a platform that is generally offered to those with contrarian views, that colleagues who signed a letter criticising her OBE were trying to bully her into silence, but Professor Stork's colleagues are entitled to just as much freedom of expression as she is. If they want to use it to criticise her, that is their prerogative. The nature of free speech is that some people will have views you don't like. And there are, of course, real threats to free speech in the form of online bullying and threats of violence that many people, particularly women and people of colour, experience. These, however, do not appear to be the focus for the pseudo-free speech activists. They are not touched on in Davis's bill. The crisis might be invented, but it is being just used to justify very real expansion of state control over universities. Roy Jenkins, a former Home Secretary and Chancellor of Oxford University, once said, "It is difficult to think of any human field of endeavour which is in central regulation is a greater enemy of excellence than that of the organisation of teaching and research of universities." Yet, central regulation is exactly what we are getting. In the 1980s, the Thatcher government stripped universities of the power to determine how their funding was distributed, handing it instead to the ministers and officials. The Cameron government eliminated funding for the humanities, consequently a discipline that commonly produces criticism of the state. Since 2015, universities have been forced to crack down on political dissent. The government has compelled them to ban such events as a panel on Kurdish political struggles at Cambridge and events supporting the rights for Palestinians at Exeter and the LES. It may be coincidental that universities and student unions have traditionally been centres of political opposition to conservative governments. Davis claims his bill will require universities to, quote, uphold freedom of speech, but such a duty already exists under both the Education Act of 1986 and the Human Rights Act of 1998. It seems, however, and I want to point this out, that a lot of people, especially in the UK, who are pseudo-free speech champions, say that free speech isn't enshrined in law in the UK. It is. It's in the Human Rights Act of 1998. But they don't seem to care. Anyway, where were we? Yes. It seems, however, that Mr. Davis's bill will refine the existing duty so as to require universities to police their academics and students. This will, in effect, force them to give a platform for speakers of whom the government approves. Mr. Davis's bill may be just the start. The Lewis letter calls on the government to ban student unions, the leadership of which is directly elected by the students, from engaging in activities that the government considers political. The report on which it is based appears to recommend using the coveted power of the state to break up unions that don't conform to the government's definition of acceptable student activities. These are real threats to freedom of speech, and they are justified on the basis of imaginary threats. As Lozensky and Zabat put it, one of the great ironies of how democracies die is that the very defense of democracy is often used as a pretext for its subversion. War is peace, freedom is slavery, free speech is censorship, and censorship is free speech. And there you go. But of course, you won't see, shall we say, the usual people who are, quote, champions of free speech talking out about this. And it's very telling. Very, very telling indeed. But, you know, as I've always said, when actual issues of free speech do come up, they don't talk about it. Unless it somehow affects them, and then, well, they'll try and spin it anyway to make money. But you won't see any of the free speech advocates actually talk about the Davis's bill or anything like that. And yet that will have a direct effect on freedom of speech in this country, because student unions who are directly elected by the students are now going to be told that if you're not towing the government's accepted line, you can't have a student union potentially, or you will be, forced to do these things. This will affect freedom of speech. And, as it said, coincidentally, very often universities have been not only the central pillar of, criticism against conservative governments, but as we saw, humanities being stripped of their funding, once again, the very central pillar that has, criticizes the government. Again, these aren't coincidences, or well, they might very well be coincidences, but they're not, shall we say, surprising coincidences. But there you go. So, as always, please do remember to hit that like and share button on your way out. And of course, down below there is a link to my Patreon page and a one-off donation link. And thank you very much to the people who do support my channel that way. And as always, we'll see you all next time.